Welcome to the Connect with BMC Helix ITSM and Remedy webinar. During today's session, you'll be able to ask our panelists questions, and the questions and answers along with today's broadcast will be published to communities and our YouTube channel a week from today's broadcast. At this time, I will turn over Digital Workplace Catalog workflow best practices and troubleshooting to Jeff Hudson.
Thanks, Greg. So as Greg mentioned, my name is Jeff Hudson. I'm a lead TSA in the DWP support team. And today we're going to cover DWP Catalog workflow best practices and troubleshooting. So let's look at today's agenda. We're first going to do an overview of Catalog and some of its components. We're going to talk about some of the key workflow elements along with some examples. We're then going to do some troubleshooting, and we're going to have some reference material. So what is DWP Catalog? It's a system that integrates with external fulfillment applications via service connectors. Some examples of those connectors are AWS, Flexera, BCM, BAO, HRCM, AD, and of course, ITSM Remedy. Some of the key components of DWP Catalog are services and workflow. A service is kind of like an SRD would be to the world of SRM. It's got your image, any help text or descriptions. It contains your workflow, your questionnaire, and your actions. And it's got any cost, quantity, or SLA information in it as well. And you can also bundle services together, so users can request bundles of multiple services at once. Workflow uses the connectors that are defined to interface with the external systems and execute commands on them. It's created using BPMN standards, and there are many tutorials out there online using those standards if you want to get some extra help using the workflow designer. And workflow can be shared across the services along with questionnaire and action. So it's kind of like a PDT would be in the world of SRM. It can be shared across multiple services and be called many times. Let's look at some of the key service components. First, we have connectors. They're used by workflow to interface with the external fulfillment systems. They must be configured before any services or workflow are going to function. So in the little example here, we've got the AWS connector, and whatever functions are available in that connector, you can do that on the system. And you could just replace the AWS connector there with the Remedy connector, the AD connector, or any one of the others. And we have various functions that are available in each one of those systems. So let's talk about variables. I've listed a few of them here. Service broker context. Those are variables. Once you define a service broker context variable, a list of variables will automatically be included for you to include in your workflows. Let's say, for instance, you're going to create an incident. There will already be tied to that workflow the customer, contact, login ID, there are several others, date fields, some status fields that will be available to you automatically defined, and you can just call those in your workflow. Process input variable. If you've defined an input variable, that's going to be tied to a question. So a process question is automatically going to be created for that because you need to have a question tied to that input variable. And a local variable. Those are used to pass values within the workflow itself. I think we've got an example of a local variable being used in one of the workflow snippets I'm going to show a little bit later on. There's also output variables that can be defined. That would be the output of one piece of a workflow is used as the input into another piece of workflow. All right, so let's talk about questions. Some of the parts of questions are the questionnaire, obviously. That's what holds all your questions, and it can be shared among workflows. The questions themselves are ones that either you create or they're process questions that are created automatically based on variables you've defined. And we also have actions. Actions are similar to actions in SRM. They can set default responses. They can answer other questions based on a previous question response, etc. They're not the same as service actions. Service actions are small pieces of workflow that can do various items for you within DWP and ITSM. So these actions are just like the ones in SRM. Service actions are documented. They're a little bit different. Like I said, it's a piece of workflow. All right, what are some of the basic workflow elements. I mean, there are many workflow elements, and all those are in the documentation. I'm just covering some of the key ones here. For the remedy connector, there's a get entry by query that allows you to return data from any object in remedy based on a query that you define. We have our standard ones that are kind of like the ones from SRM. We've got to create incidents, change, or a work order. Those would be similar to the AOTs that we have in SRM that's creating those. And we also have a set entry where you can obviously set entry on any record in remedy based on some values that you populate. Activities and gateways. We have a receive task. That comes in handy when we're going to do some kind of status syncing between the fulfillment systems and DWP. A call activity, that's something that calls an external activity process. An example of that would be an approval, the management chain approval, or some other activity you may have. And then we have a gateway. We have exclusive gateway, which is kind of like a conditional flow. Then we have parallel gateways where multiple things can be executing at the same time. So you could consider an exclusive gateway to be kind of like a condition in a PDT from the SRM side. If that's met, it goes on that path of the flow. If not, it follows another. And then on the DWP catalog side of the elements, we have a build input set, which is helpful when you're trying to create items. You can tell it what items need to be included in there. The send in-app notification. Now that in-app notification is in the context of DWP catalog. It's only going to appear there. It's helpful for troubleshooting workflow, which we're going to do a little bit later with one. It helps you to confirm your workflow is doing what you want it to. You'll get the notification within the DWP catalog console, and you can see what's in there as far as what your queries came back with, what you set, or any of the other information you may have called. And then there's a send email function. This is in the context of DWP catalog. So this email would come from DWP catalog, so you'd need to have email configured for this to work. Like the approval that comes from catalog, it's actually using an ITSM approval. So that's going to be a little bit of a different object than this. This send email is one strictly coming from DWP catalog, not from the ITSM system. So as I mentioned before, the receive task and gateway can be used in status-driven processing. So the receive task can wait for a response from the external system before it progresses to the next part or sets a status. And you can also put a timer on there saying, I need to check this every hour, every minute, however often you want to check to make sure that the status comes back, and then that'll sync the status between, or it can do other functions, but one of the main ones is status syncing. Sync the status between the external fulfillment system and the DWP request. And then there's a gateway. So the gateway will determine the processing path based on what comes back. So the gateway would be you can use an exclusive gateway to determine if we're going to proceed one path based on what value comes back from the receive task. And the receive task makes use of remote action. So we're going to talk a little more about remote action. We know that remote action is used in approvals, but it's also used in this process as well. So we're going to cover remote action in one of our troubleshooting scenarios, because if your remote action process is having issues, not only would approvals be affected, but also status syncing would be affected as well. So error handlers. These allow the workflow to continue processing even if an error was encountered. So if you have an error boundary, it can check for any kind of an error that may occur. So if you have a workflow that's going to do something in ITSM and there's an error that may occur if something's not in place, I was thinking of an example like a work order manager not being defined, you would get back that 1440853 message. You could, in remedy, if we got that back in SRM, that would be the end of your work order. It would not get created. But here in DWP Catalog, you could pick up on that 1440853 and give the workflow another path to continue on, to attempt to create another work order or an incident or something else so that it would move on and not get hung up there with the error boundary. Now, that obviously would apply to all the other fulfillment systems as well. If there's any errors that could come across in them, you could utilize the error boundary to have the processing continue even though an error may have occurred. And then the error end is pretty much what it mentions there. The workflow will end and the error that it received will be displayed in the workflow. So if something were to not work properly and you wanted the workflow to stop at that point, you could put an error end in there and it would display the error number back to the user. All right, so now we're going to cover some workflow examples. We've got 3 here that we're going to cover. We're going to do a multi-instance loop notification. It's a small example. The key part of it is a multi-instance loop. This allows you to loop through results that come back and process each one of them individually. We're then going to have an add remove users from AD, which is going to make use of the AD connector. And then we're going to use the JSON parser, which came in, I believe it was maybe in 1905 or 1908, to pass a stored value from questions. Because right now in DWP Catalog, the question response by default, it passes a display value. In SRM, you could do displayed or stored for a static menu, but using the JSON parser here, you can pass the stored value if you want, and we've got an example that's going to use that. Our first workflow example is going to be a multi-instance loop that will send an email to a group of support folks. Let's take a look at the workflow. It's a pretty basic workflow. The key takeaway here is the multi-instance loop aspect of it. So we have a get entry by query defined. Actually, before we look at that, let's look at the variables we have defined since we spoke about variables earlier. So we have a support group name variable, which is an input variable, and it's required. And we have a describe the problem variable, which is input as well. And we have service broker context, and then we have person, which is a local variable, which is going to be utilized in the multi-instance loop. So if we check our questions, because we had mentioned about the process input variables, we look at the questions, we see that 2 of them were already predefined, the process questions. Those came in for us as we had defined those input variables. So back in the workflow, look at the get entry by query. There's our remedy connector. We're going to be querying this support group people association join form in remedy. And our query is going to be based on the support group name that we select. The profile status is enabled, assignment availability, yes. And of course, we want to make sure they have an email address defined because ultimately an email will be sent. We're going to do a send an in-app notification and of this person, and it's going to multi-instance loop. This is our local variable person. It's going to multi-instance loop through the results from the get entries by query. Now, all we're getting back in the in-app notification, I'm simply just returning the login ID. We'll look at the report data for the service request, and you'll see all the data that was returned from the get entries by query. It'll be every field that's available on the form for those users. But the only thing we're going to return back in the in-app notification is the login ID. And then we have a send email. This is the catalog send email. So you would need to make sure you have that configured on your catalog system. You could just as easily do a create input set and put records into the AR system email messages form as well to send those emails out. So the input map to the send email is just going to be the internet email of the results from the get entries by query. And then, the content, we have some of the values here, the service name, and describe the problem as well. And it's, of course, going to do the loop through there as well to loop through and send emails to all those users. So if we go to the catalog, I'm going to search for it. We're going to put in a value there, and we're going to pick service desk 2 group. Okay, we see that it's completed. All right, a request was submitted. Let's check the service request report for that. There's all the data that came back from the get entry by query. We see all that data that came back for the query that we had generated based on those question responses. And the multi-instance loop, we see that we had 5 occurrences, so it ran 5 times. That tells us it's looped through. We got 5 records back. And of course, the send email has 5 records as well. So if we look at the in-app notification, and here's our login ID value that came back with that. So we have 5 of those. Alan, Mary, Francie, Ian, and Bob. We got our 5 values back there as well. So you could obviously make the workflow a little more, elaborate here, but the key takeaway is the multi-instance loop and how you can get entries and act upon them by looping through the data. So our next example is going to be adding or removing a user from Active Directory. So I believe this is our workflow here. It's a pretty simple workflow. And if you're integrated with LDAP on the ITSM side, you could use lookups to determine the user to either add or remove and the groups as well. But for this simple example, we're just doing a build input set based on a couple of question variables that we have defined, login name and the group name. And we see those variables over here. We have a group name and SAM account name, which is essentially the login name. So we have a gateway here, exclusive gateway, and it's set to pretty simple. If it's doing an add, it's going to go to add Active Directory user to group. If not, it's going to do the remove. So the user that we're working with is a user. The user's name is Daniel. We're going to query, and this is a line to pay attention to. The member of shows a member of 5 groups on this system. So we're going to go into Digital Workplace here. Let's find this service. We're going to add, and I said, you can have a query set up here or look up anything else to get the name. And we're just simply adding Daniel to a group called support. So we submit the request. That moves to completed. Let's clear our screen here. We run the query again. We see that Daniel is a member of 6 groups. So he was added successfully to the group named support. If we want to just run this again to remove him from the group, we would just change this action to remove, submit the request again, clear our screen one more time, and we now see that once again he's a member of 5 groups. So we've just simply added him to a group and removed him from it. That's some of the functionality that AD connector supplies. There's you can find computers, add users, search for users as well. So our last example is going to be using the JSON parser to parse through queried data to send the stored value of a question. So if we look at the workflow, first let's look at the questions. This question is going to be the key one. We notice that the displayed value and stored value are different. Displayed value, question 1, 2, 3, stored value, stored 1, 2, 3. Keep that in mind as we go through the example. So if we look at the workflow, we've got some variables defined for our question data as well as context variable here. So if we look at the first item, it is the parser. So we're going to get the data back from our question response that we enter in. And this is essentially what we're passing now. This is the display value. We wouldn't have to normally do this. This is just strictly for the example. So we're going to first pass the displayed value. Like I said, this doesn't need to be done. It's strictly because the display value passes automatically by default, but we're just going to show that this is going to obtain the displayed value, and then we'll look through the JSON output to get the descriptor for the stored value so that we can pass it on the next run of this. So there's online help for building this JSON query here available because it's not the most straightforward syntax to use. So that's going to take our displayed value. Now we have a replace all here because there are brackets around these values and we're replacing them with spaces. And we're going to send an in-app notification just with the response that we got back. And we're going to create a work order. And in the summary field of the work order, we're going to put the output of our JSON parsed data. So let's get into DWP. Let's search for this. Okay, so the first thing we're going to pick is question 2, and we're going to submit. So now, since we're passing the displayed value, in our work order, I would expect to see question 2 in the summary field. And sure enough, there it is. There's question 2. That was based on our parsed data. So if we come back in to our workflow, actually we need to go to the notification. We can go to the report here, I'm sorry. We'll look at the report and we can look at the data that came back from this when we submitted our question. And we see the value of the stored value is being described by the term value. They're stored to, and it just looks like the string value is what's describing it. So we are going to edit our response in the JSON parser, and we're going to put value in there. So if we come back in here to the workflow, and we simply replace that with value, we then come back into DWP we request it again. We're going to do question 2 the same as before. Now though, when we're go back to ITSM and we search for this, we see that stored to has now been passed. So if we go to the report for this, here's our report for this one. There's our output. It's stored to, and we see that we did we see what the replace did. The replace pulled those brackets out, and it was able to send that. And there's what the replace did. The brackets were removed. They're stored to. The in-app notification was sent, and the create remedy work order was done. And we saw the stored to value in the work order. Now that we've completed our demos, we're going to go ahead and transition into some troubleshooting scenarios. Before I get into the troubleshooting examples, I just wanted to remind everybody we've got troubleshooting information on the BMC support site with the documentation. It's just on the same page as you see here with the DWP 2002. There's just a troubleshooting link with various scenarios for troubleshooting RSSO, SSL, login issues, and also how to collect various logs for DWP. All right, for our first troubleshooting issue, we're going to have a scenario where we've got a status-driven workflow that's not proceeding as expected. And that's normally a problem with remote action. And we have a KA out there on this as well that has some steps to troubleshoot. And usually this is an issue with the SB remote or local configuration values, or it could be an issue with one of the Java path entries in the remote action files that exist on the catalog box or the ITSM box. So let's take a look at a quick demo of this. Here's my workflow. It's a pretty simple workflow. All it's doing is creating an incident, and we're doing a receive task, and we're going to set the service request status to completed when this work status is resolved. So essentially, like I said, this is pretty straightforward. When the incident gets resolved, we set the service request to completed, and we put in a status reason and just say the incident has been resolved. So let's go ahead and see this in action here. Okay, so I've submitted my request. Let's go to the stub form. This is a good form to use for troubleshooting purposes as well, to see if you've got any issues going on, because you can check the transmission status, and that'll give you an idea if there's some kind of a problem going on between catalog and ITSM. So here's my record in the stub form, and we see that the incident number here is 714. So we're going to go over there to 714. Within our incident, we're going to go ahead and set this incident to resolved. And based on our workflow, that should set our service request to completed. So we've saved it. Let's go back into DWP, and we see that our service request is still in progress. So let's go back to our stub record. Let's check it, and we see that it failed to send. So that tells us there was some kind of a communication issue with the remote action process. And we see an error message here. It just says connection refused to connect. So if you're running, I believe this came in 2002, may have been 1911, but I believe 2002, there's a test SB test remote action form where you can just test the connection based on your config values. And we're going to run this, and it said it failed. Error occurred. The error was in, and it says connection refused, host name, port number, and I notice an error here in my port number. My port number, it's off by 1 digit. It should be 8008. And that's in my that's in my remote approval config form. So if we go to the remote approval config form, bring it up, it is 8009. So I'm going to save that to the correct value of 8008. And we're going to come back in here and we're going to test it again. Okay, so now we know we've got a good connection here. So at this point, we have the stub record still sitting here. I don't believe this is just going to process on its own. We have the stub record still sitting here at failed to send. So what we can do with the stub record at this point in time, it's kind of like the CAI event in a way, even though there's not quite as much to it. We just need to set this to waiting to be sent. So if we save this record now with waiting to be sent, because we see down here the work status and it already is resolved, so that should move our service request to completed. So let's go ahead and save this guy. And now we see, after it's been saved, that it instantly went to sent. So now let's go back in DWP and we can check our request, and we see that our request did move to completed, and there's our note that our incident, our status reason there, the incident has been resolved. So even though these forms say local approval config and remote approval config, they're definitely used for the approval data as well when you're doing an approval. But they're also used when there's other syncing between ITSM and catalog that's going on. So keep that in mind if you have any issues with status syncing between a request and something in ITSM. Let's move on to our second scenario. This scenario, it isn't pure troubleshooting, but troubleshooting went into this to determine a method to have this workflow continue when a failure occurred so that it could continue to process and the end user would have some activity for them, even though the original path may not have been followed. And the cause of this could be due to data issue. Maybe somebody wasn't available for assignment, there was a system issue, or some other unexpected condition could have occurred. So essentially, we're going to make use of something I mentioned earlier, an error boundary, so that another path in the workflow can continue to execute. So if we want to equate this back to something I mentioned before, SRM, when something fails in SRM and you fail to get a fulfillment ticket, that end user is kind of stuck until that CAI event is processed, especially if there's a failed one. Sometimes there may be an issue where the queue may be having an issue and you can restart the AR server and it'll pick it up and the queue will continue on in CAI. But if a record fails until that underlying condition is addressed and the record is manually reprocessed, you are not going to have a fulfillment ticket for that end user. This scenario in DWP Catalog will allow the workflow to continue processing so the end user at least has some kind of activity going on. There's something going on for them in the back end, even though it may not be the original ticket that was created for them. So let's take a look at this workflow. Okay, this is my workflow here, I believe, order new equipment. And for this scenario, I don't have any questions because essentially we're just testing out the error boundary workflow. Okay, so here's what I've got. The error boundary is going to run by default on you can attach it to a call activity, a sub process, or receive task. And with the sub process, it's going to catch errors for all the processes in there. So this call activity is calling this piece of workflow. And for the sake of this example, this is going to fail. I already know it's going to fail. It was just set up for the example. But in real world, you can have this to catch errors in case, like I said, what if you're trying to create a work order and there's no work order managers available for assignment? You could then pick up an error boundary to have another work order created and route it to a default group automatically or something like that. So we're going along something along those lines where you know there could be a possible failure. You're just going to pick it up and carry it on. So let's look at our boundary. We're going to capture all exceptions in this boundary. And what we've got is I've got to create activity log for the service request. And the text of it is essentially initial work order creation failed. Now I've got this set to internal. So this is going to log in the service request report, which we'll look at here in a minute. So here's our fallback work order. We're just creating a work order that it's just something simple here. Contingency work order is all I've called it. Then we're setting the service request status, and we're setting a status reason so that the end user can see what that status reason was. And we just have a receive task here when this goes to complete. So let's go ahead and see this one in action to see what happens when it does get triggered. All right, so let's search for this. I'd searched for it before, so let's search for it in here. Okay, so there it is. There's our request. So like I said, we have no questions. We know what's going to happen here. Okay, so the request has been submitted. We see that it's in progress. So that tells us that our fallback work order was created, and it says error encountered, alternate work order created. So that's we see that in our status. So let's go to the service request report and look at this. This service request report can be a handy tool for troubleshooting to get some basic details on errors that may require additional logging, but it also may point you to what could be going on with your issue. So here's mine, service order new equipment. And there's my internal comment there. Now, what we can do is if we wanted to make that external, that would actually show up in the request in DWP. So we can do that here in a minute with it. So let's go back to the process. Okay, so this tells me that our fallback was executed because there's our error that came from our initial activity. It says 102, and I had that set up to capture all exceptions. So that's why it triggered on the other end of the flow that it did. And there's our fallback work order. And if I come in here to ITSM and I search for that work order, it should be with the new title of the contingency. And there it is, contingency work order. So this allows the processing to still occur in the back end, even though there was an error with the initial submission. So that may require some, data updates or something to go on in the system, but at least the end user their ticket isn't more or less stuck. Okay, so if we go back to the workflow, the only thing I wanted to show here was if we change the activity log entry. So we'll change that. Okay, and we see that it's internal. So if I make this public, and this may be something that you want to do with it anyway, so the end user sees it in case they don't see it in the status reason of the request. So that's good to go. So now if we come back in here to DWP and request this again, and we submit it, we now see we have a comment, initial work order creation failed. So that went into the comment section of the request. So the end user could see that straight away. They would get that comment and they would know if they weren't going to, if they didn't know to click the information button next to the status for the status reason. So that's another option that can be done in that workflow. So essentially that workflow just gives you a way of taking potential errors that could maybe stop your workflow and allows you to continue so that the end user doesn't have an impact. Okay, so that was our last troubleshooting scenario. Here's some references that are available that can be helpful when working with workflow for DWP Catalog. Obviously, there's a link to the workflow documentation. The JSON path methodology, which I mentioned in the JSON parser example. They said that's a little tricky to get used to, but that link there has good information on it and how it works. There's the remedy query syntax that's very useful when trying to put together statements and get entry by query or build input sets. We have another webinar that was done recently on catalog install and deployment, and the links to our troubleshooting documentation. So to summarize what we covered today, we covered an overview of Digital Workplace Catalog and some of the key service components. We covered some main workflow elements along with some workflow examples of some common scenarios that you may come across, and we did some troubleshooting of some issues that could be encountered when working with workflow. Thanks for attending, and with that, I'll turn it back over to Greg.
Thank you, Jeff, and I'll take us through the self-help and contacting BMC, our YouTube channel where this webinar will be posted, along with previous webinar recordings, and a rich set of how-to videos are available. The Connect with BMC Helix ITSM and Remedy schedule is available at this community's link, has our future webinar schedules, as well as past webinars that we've presented. The Hot Off the Press newsletter is available at this community's link. It has a lot of trending information that you can find. As always, to contact BMC technical support via web, phone, email, or these social channels. And that will conclude this webinar. Thank you for attending.